I'm going to discuss parts of my current research practice. Conversations with the Caryatid is the title of or theme of my presentation, particularly looking at it through hybrid practices of movement, storytelling, space, place, and the use of technology, which in my current work is through video and screen media. The current topic or title of my investigation is choreography as a spatial, emergent and creative mode of practice, which very much signals this sort of idea of making with the body. And as a hybrid practitioner, I'm really looking at kinesthesia and the embodied experience of space. The idea is to have two directions, both architecture as embodied and civic engagement, so how the two disciplines can kind of impact on each other. And the overall aim is to really explore these embodied approaches to design. And that's something that is quite important in the context of technology. One could interpret technology quite broadly. And I think that what I've begun to do is really think about time-based media as a space of and place of making. So this is quite interesting in terms of the stage that I'm at now with the project and with the videos you shall see in a little while. One last point I want to make is the theoretical framework I'm using, as all the practitioners that I'm looking at and philosophers, Laban's work, Henri Lefebvre, the philosopher. Interestingly, Laban was both a dancer and an architect. And the architect Bernard Tschumi, who did design the Acropolis Museum, which is part of my case study. So each of these three share a body perspective of space, a body-centric approach. So that really puts the human experience in the context of place as meaningful, and also perception. Beginning with perception, the qualitative experiential aspects of environment, of the body, as we create and move and make spaces, be it through dance, choreography, or design practice, or indeed as inhabitants. Therefore, the relativity of space and time. And one last note for each of these practitioners. Again, emphasizing the notion of making, Laban very much deals with the interpretation of experience of space, beginning with that, the body as the passageway through, not only how we arrive at a shape or a form, but being aware, self-conscious. So he also brings in architectonic ideas and philosophical conceptions of space. And what's particularly of interest is his notion of living architecture. So movement, and I would add the body by extension, is to speak a living architecture. In terms of Lefebvre's approach, I think what's important with Lefebvre is that his thesis is very much examining definitions and concepts of space, but proposing that to truly understand social space, we need to understand a qualitative approach, how experience is meaningful to us. And this is particularly important for architects because he breaks down in this like little triadic model, perceived, conceived, and lived space. And they can never really be in separation. These are three enmeshed processes: how we perceive, inhabit, live our daily life, how we conceive and design ideas. And then that's a kind of a constant cycle of producing and reproducing. So again, I would also interpret this qualitative approach in connection with making. And finally, with Tschumi's philosophy of body and space, again, locality is not about just a positioning, it's architecture as event. Architecture begins with the body and that body moves. So Tschumi suggests flow and movement precedes form, that one designs the in-between, the thresholds, the passageways, the circulation of space. And then from that, and the programmatic intention, which by that in architecture we mean the use, the designated use and organizations, and through this interaction of flow and use, event is created, the experience, the drama of the inhabitation of the architecture. And one final note on context. for me, the field that I've been investigating so far, the current notions in the field, that inhabitant user and creative user, sensory and participatory modes, immersive modes of practice are very much in the fore of the choreography architecture relationship, indeed as separate practices and at points where collaboration and dialogue occurs. But there is, for me, an opportunity for a truly hybrid approach to be explored to add to this. So how can we develop a somatic and experiential approach? And moving on to the last slide, my proposal is going to be investigated through this idea of kinesynthesis. So kinesthesia and synthesis. So a sort of kinesthetic philosophy. And by this, I'm hinting at this suggestion of kinesthesia, the body motion perception field, and synthesis, the composition design choreographic approach. So how we make space with and through the body. And I think this very much connects to sort of notions of place. So place, technology, movement, I think that I wouldn't identify them as separate aspects of the work. I think they all dovetail and interrelate. And through my particular lens of practice, I'm very interested in cultural identity, performance, and space. And I do this by exploring cultural heritage broadly, tangible and intangible cultures, folklore and storytelling, and through space, architecture, performance, and using digital media technologies at present through video art and screen media. So not only video art that will be, say, consumed or seen or experienced through the intersubjective, but screen media also as a mode, as a time-based medium. In architecture design school, time-based media are very, very much useful for exploring experiential ideas that sort of alleviate the sort of static notion of drawing and model making, and has very much impacted on how technology overall has developed in the production of architecture. So at this point, I'll talk about the screen media aspect, video art, whereas the future development for a virtual museum design will kind of take on notions of interactivity, network media, and connectivity. But that's the next stage. My critical frame for the conversation today is to explore this idea of liminal space. Liminal space as thresholds and passageways, but also transformation. And I've kind of adopted the idea from and been inspired by Susan Broadhurst, liminal space and film technology. So I think what's really interesting about Broadhurst's proposition, of course, it was written in 1999. So we're going back a couple of decades, and then more recent work about technology kind of elaborates more specific notions of interactivity. But in the cinematic sense, I think that taking on this idea of various subject positions, no position is fixed and unalterable in a liminal film. There's a multiplicity of codes, a meta-cinematic questioning, and a self-reflexive approach. And I think that's very interesting from indeed working as a performance artist from the auto-ethnographic perspective. And also design practice is a very self-reflexive process, the way we now encourage students and education to develop self-reflexive approaches for the reflective kind of practitioner's approach. And of course, she draws on Turner's notions of liminal based on, ritual practice, liminal, liminoid. I think also what's really, really interesting about embodied positional experiential localities of place, certainly in emotional geography and embodiment ideas, that place is not a fixed, it's a moment, it's multiple, contested, fluid, uncertain. So there are multiple interpretations of the subjective experience, even so place has its particular characteristic, an experiential and continuous flux. For me, moving through space and time is like a transsubjective kind of notion of the body as passageway while experiencing and traversing space. So liminal is the merging between the ritual, everyday, habitual, and the imaginary. And again, drawing upon Laban, a passageway through movement. And I will talk now about some examples, but in technology, I've really been using performance as documentary theatre, and the visual and embodied aspects of the filming, which can be through a variety of means, is very much a kind of a mixture of both choreographed and preset intentional kind of framing, but also exploratory stuff or ad hoc, in situ, spontaneous moments of capturing experience through a mobile phone. My practice occurs through different modes of a living ancestry project, based on personal ancestry, an interactive design studio, and the Acropolis project, which I'll show you now. So this performative proposal is very much investigating the idea of how can we bring, expand performance strategies for museum architecture. Potentially in future, this could be through interactivity, but at the moment, I'm really kind of exploring the first base of the idea, which is the collective memory of the city, and just trying to investigate the concepts for this. And again, Toshumi's design here is all about the organization of flow. And one thing that's been important with my work is to talk about the caryatid character, a persona who tells the story of the city. The caryatids are very interesting as they are historically part of the site. They're now concrete copies. The original caryatid is in the British Museum, and the 5 remaining are in the Acropolis Museum. And as we can see, there's an absence of she who is in the British Museum. If you look at the central picture, there are 5. So this caryatid persona and this performative approach that I've developed, it's very much thinking about the layers of the collective memory as I experience the city. She, I, the caryatid. So these are choreographic explorations of mythical aspects of the character persona. Paper is a recurring theme as it's unfolded down the main trajectory of the Aerobayidu Avenue. And this persona, she, female archetype, an artist-architect, endeavors on a trajectory as the missing caryatid to retell the story of the city and self. So place here has a place of origin, but there is also a placeness of the embodied notion of I in a contemporary historical circumstance, and also those of the female diaspora artist returning to Athens, discovering her roots and discovering her local personal ancestry in relation then to the polis in terms of the backdrop of the city and the urban transformation of change. In the Living Ancestry project, which will become a bio-choreographic, bio-digital space, the ancestors here are my grandparents below the caryatid in Athens some 100 years ago. The conversation with that which is left behind, the residue of the archive, the folklore and the myth, and the documentary kind of magic realism of storytelling through discovering one's journey of an ever-evolving self that comes through. And finally, working on the context of the studio, designing a personal space, and the personal space, a live workspace within the historical heritage of my ancestors, is a very interesting project. Currently designing a studio for architectural space and working on various kinds of artistic residencies that can take place. So now developing in future a kind of live work unit, which will also have a combined dance and design studio, something that blurs the boundaries of the virtual and the real, as in the post-pandemic situation that was accelerated, and revisiting past work where now the technology is available to consider future ways of engaging performance space through interactive, mediated network environments. So again, this is, like I say, a future project and evolution. And the last thing that I want to show you, because we have reached a 15-minute time limit, just a very, very quick playback of part of the film process of the caryatid story. And really, in conclusion, this self-reflexive notion of film movement, place and space, this merging of the inner outer, for me, it's really come to the fore of this idea of liminality as a process of making, that which we reflect back on ourselves as we produce and create, no longer just a subject or object, but the in-between process of lived experience and indeed ourselves. Based on looking at part of my research, we'll be looking at what the local planning policies are
in the city of Athens. There is a cultural section for the municipality of Athens that actually designs the projects that have any kind of cultural relationship to the space. I imagine that would include things like the Athens Festival, etc., which takes place annually in the summer. But what I think would be particularly interesting is to see how can a performance practice think tank join in with this kind of civic department, and to see if they would be open to some explorations. Because what happens at the moment is that we have a lot of fringe stuff in Athens. There's a lot of amateur and professional performers who, because of the economy and the social situation here, have to handle many jobs, and then their art is something that they do as a labour of love. And then you've got big institutional festivals that take place. What I haven't seen yet is where there are site-specific or participatory works, it's often a platform set up by a cultural institution that invites artists to participate. But we haven't yet got something that could actually act as a laboratory to actually draw from those modes of practice and embed them into design processes themselves as part of the planning of the city. And that's kind of where the direction I'm going in. I had a recent conversation with a colleague, and I think what's interesting, say in London, that's happening with civic space, is that we are planning policy is probably in the London plan, or they're revising it, but it's beginning to change because of the pandemic situation. Apart from the site of home shifting and working from home, and the economy of public and private space changing in that sense, and a lot of knock-on effects with the economy as businesses having to become very inventive in relocating or changing the way they do business. London is setting up like micro hubs that are going to become little satellites that are going to form clusters of community that have a particular radius and access point, for example. And I think that that's really interesting, because we're going the opposite way to what was once decentralization in the Green Belt, for example, in post-war UK, post-war Britain. And I think that a lot of hubs like the Tate Modern, for instance, has become a hub on the South Bank, and having studied as a student, actually done performance work along that area, there's really interesting examples of how cultural spaces are becoming activators for the local community. That's increasingly the case. But I want to test it out in terms of how can you question the institutional structures we have in the polis, and how can we move away from simply a conventional, say, in the case study of the Acropolis Museum, where digital media and film are still very much a kind of a 2D book space, if you like. There isn't yet a program that expands the idea of participation through other means. And of course, that implies regulatory space, policy, boundaries, and it will be interesting to see how open they will be to actually attempting this kind of process. That's kind of where I'm at with the thinking right now. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. One other question before, I mean, maybe we're going to open it up to some questions, if that's sorry, after the panel. Okay, so one other thing is, just can you articulate a little bit about, we've had lots of conversations about movement and the role movement can play in a design process, and you mentioned Tashumi, where Tashumi starts with the flow diagram of people movement, and the movement of people through space is of paramount. So do you want to talk a little bit about your concept of synthesis, and how that will influence, or how it could influence, design processes?
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, in terms of, as I've sort of tried to explain in the context in the presentation, the way I'm trying to develop the idea of kinesynthesis, and what I have found so far in my survey of the field, is that while in pedagogical context, there's a lot of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary modules that are proposed for student training in design practice. You get lots of collaborations in Europe. I've found examples in the States. In fact, Bronnie is a very interesting example. She's a professor of transdisciplinary work, and she's an architect. She did used to dance, and she's known for creating a lot of interdisciplinary models in education. But what I find often happens is that the kinesthetic training or tuning that we have as performance artists, there isn't enough time, first of all, in a workshop to transpose that fully. And I think that there's an opportunity to go a little bit deeper and not only observe visual modes or compositional modes of doing design practice. In collaborations, the architect is still, and Stephen Spear talks about this in his article, I think it's not that one is subservient to the choreographer, but you are serving a design purpose, and you're collaborating with the modes of who you are, but you're not actually dancing the design directly. So what I want to find out is what happens if we do bring in this kind of a performative aspect, but through unpeeling the layers of identity, one's body, one's sense of self, imagination, and using that as a tool to explore design ideas. So in a way, it's kind of creating a bridge for something that's already in conversation, but helping to unpeel the layers at a deeper level. And in terms of movement, I think what's really interesting as a performance artist and a designer is we have to think, because my argument is to an extent architecture is an embodied design approach. It's just that it's happening through a highly tuned visual imaginationary kind of visual spatial practice. But if you bring in the specifics of the individual, the human experience, I would like to think that will make architects more empathic designers to understand human scale. In the Acropolis Museum, people enjoy the flow and the experience of the space, but at the urban scale, it's very much, it has a very strict boundary. People don't engage with it as part of the urban environment. They're disconnected, and I think there's a lack of human scale in urban planning. So I think at that point, there's some really interesting ways that one can connect processes of movement, because movement happens in many ways, not just to design form, but to explore and understand how we are experiencing ourselves in both our everyday practice, but creative movement flow as well. And I think that in between, and taking Laban's idea of effort and understanding that in relation to ergonomics, everyday movement, and then creative practices of movement.